How are we all?
How's it going?
Have you enjoyed the week? Good? Excellent. Who was here on Monday for the workshop? Anyone? Oh, yeah, a few hands.
Cool.
Okay. Maybe about a third to half. I think Fowler is on his way, although he's a little non-committal. I've been texting him the last 10 minutes. He hasn't replied yet, so we'll see. He's supposed to be coming. I think the thing says the Aspire team. The team is bigger than this. This is just the people who are here.
Yeah, exactly.
Our team is quite distributed. We have folks on different coasts of this country. We have here's Fowler. We have folks in different countries and different time zones. We only have a handful of folks who are actually based in Redmond. So we have a few folks here today. Fowler's coming down now. But the goal out of this session is really to answer your questions. There's no set agenda. You just have us for an hour and a bit to answer any questions about Aspire that you might have, either about what we've done so far, where we might be going in the future. We're very, very happy to answer those. Just stick your hand up and we'll point out and we'll go from there. If anything leads to some interesting points, we'll do so. But I'll repeat. Oh, Mike's over here, mate. We'll repeat the question so the room can hear it. We won't have to run around with mics and whatnot. So without further ado, Fowler's here. There you go. There's a hand right here. Yes, sir.
I raised my hand earlier saying I was here for the workshop.
Yeah.
Different workshop. I didn't know you were asking about this.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, we had an Aspire workshop in here on Monday. Yep. So the question was?
I got it.
Repeat the question.
The question was, do we support, thank you, Damian. Do we support deploying to either like your own self-hosted Kubernetes or non-AKS? And the answer to that question is yes. There's a tool that we just did a demo of. Maddie and I did a session on deployment at the .NET Aspire Developers Day, I guess, last week. And there's a tool called Aspirate with an 8, kind of like the old techno band Alternate. I'm showing my age here. But that is a command line tool that was originally submitted to us in the open source community, and we've been working with them ever since. You want to talk about the plans, or?
Yeah, we plan to incorporate it, actually.
Yeah, we're planning on bringing that in so that it has our name on it, and so we sign it. I'm waiting for this gentleman to tell me what to do there. But we're planning on bringing that in, and that'll be probably the experience, kind of like AZD, where you do AZD and you get your bicep. You would use Aspirate, you would get your YAML, your catch YAML. What we'll probably do is work alongside the AZD team so that they would like lay down your cluster. If you're in AKS, they would lay down your cluster, and then we would shell out to Aspirate and do the YAML generation and push it up from there. But the nice thing is you'd be able to use the Aspirate tool for any Kubernetes platform.
To your point, though, you don't have to do that.
Right.
Like you got a DevOps team, you can tell your DevOps team, keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
You don't have to change anything
Exactly.
at all. Like the thing to take away from Aspire is it's not a new platform that you have to deploy or opt into in order to get the benefit in production. In fact, your actual applications, like your .NET apps, your compute, or your Node apps, or whatever you're orchestrating with Aspire during dev, they just apps. There's nothing really particularly special about them. It's just that Aspire, from a development point of view, sits above them and kind of lets you coordinate them all and configure them. You don't have to adopt anything from that as part of your deployment pipeline. Fowler showed some stuff and talked about this on Monday, whereby we do have this concept of an Aspire manifest. So from your app host project, which is where you write C# to coordinate containers and databases and .NET projects, your apps, you can eject a JSON file, and it describes everything that you've written in C# effectively, with all the tokens in place that say, hey, this ASP.NET Core application at this CS proj path, it's going to need these 4 environment variables when it's deployed, and the values for these are either going to be these literal values, or it'll be an expression that says, I need the value from this other resource, like the password you're going to generate, or the URL that you're going to deploy to, whatever it might be. So you could use that just as a deployment aid. Like you could literally use that as an input to a manual process for writing your deployment script or your deployment bicep or whatever it is you're using, your YAMLs or whatever it is today. And you don't have to adopt any tools. Like Aspire does not have a production-ready deployment story today. Like that's something to be very clear about. Right. The stuff that we shipped with AZD in Aspire, the current version, is a dev test story for now, as we continue kind of on this journey of figuring out what can we really do to drive as much into the C# up front and then kind of automate the rest. But at the same time, acknowledging that there are companies, lots of companies like DevOps teams that don't want that. They're not going to use that. They're never going to use that. They have their own processes and pipelines they're going to use. You can just keep doing that. It's totally fine. there's lots of benefit to using Aspire in the dev inner loop, even if you're not using the deployment part.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, of course.
You said possibly just use it for your inner loop, let do the Helm charts and everything like they're doing on like pipeline. But part of the cool stuff that I've seen when I saw demo, and I wasn't here for the full workshop, was the automatic configuration of like host names, where like the web service has to talk to API service, and it knows the name.
Yep.
And normally what we're doing today is using Docker Compose for that, so it has a host name. We configure that ourselves with binding configuration with the options pattern.
Yep.
For like the host name and things like that. But because that's all kind of magic in Aspire.
So it's not magic. So let me unpack about how it works. Yeah.
How do you, if we're going over
Yep. How do you make it work? Yeah, so the question is about service discovery. Aspire, as part of the 20 things that we built and called Aspire, we have this element called service discovery, which is actually just a new standalone package, Microsoft.extensions.service discovery. And it's a new set of services that live in your DI container that you can use to programmatically say, hey, I want to get an address or addresses for this friendly named thing. And then we plumb on top of that, we leverage kind of that facility in the Aspire app host by virtue of just like setting environment variables that match the scheme that the service discovery configuration provider supports. So there's kind of a left-hand, right-hand thing. So your app is saying, I want to talk to HTTPS:/service1. That app has configured inside of itself the service discovery pipeline with the default providers, one of which is the configuration provider. So when a request is, it tries to make a request out for service one, it goes, okay, do I have an address for service one? No. Let me go through the providers that have been registered. Oh, there's one for config. Let me go to the config system and see if there's a value that matches the key scheme that we invented for the service discovery system. When you run an Aspire locally, it's just setting environment variables to match that scheme. That's all it is. It's not type-based or a protocol or anything like that. It's very, very straightforward. So if you want that service discovery kind of client-side or consumption-side stuff to light up in your app, you just have to set a config value like services, service name, scheme name, like 0. It's ordinal. Like you can have more than one address per service. So it's very straightforward.
That's why I was environment variables.
Yep, no problem. Let's have a look. Any next question? No questions. There's going to be no questions. It's a very, very long hour.
Yeah.
You want to take that one?
Yeah. So the question was, is there any way for the Aspire manifest to handle virtual networks and gateways? Is that the question?
Getting there.
The way to think about the manifest is just a serialized version of your C# code that you can hand off to DevOps team or to other tools to then produce actual assets that can be deployed on some environment, right? Could be cloud, could be wherever, right? And you don't think about the resources described in the manifest as magical. When you say I want to use a service bus, we stick in the manifest a bicep resource that literally describes all the properties and the ARM resources used to deploy a service bus resource. So if you want to do a virtual network, you could just add a new bicep resource and then have that file that describe the networking information. That's not what we want to expose to users as a first-class thing. We're trying to make networking a bit more magical. So when you say, service A wants to talk to database X and you want to be secure, we don't want you to have to describe every facet of like VNets and subnets and everything to make that work. We want to be able to, on the fly, make networking secure if you don't care about every single detail of the like underlying infra, right? So I think there will be cases where we give you control and say, hey, if you want to describe all of the ISE and you want to be super verbose and you basically want to write bicep in C#, like go ahead and do it. But I think the default case will be you tell us about connections between your components, your app and your DB, your app and your cache, your app and your bus. And then we say, okay, you want a secure configuration? We'll put you in a VNet and we'll make sure the subnet is exposed and we'll make sure there's a private link. And we want to make that part magical. And you as a dev just tell us, I need access to these things in a very secure way. If that makes sense, right? And the manifest is really not magical. It really is just like, how do we give a thing to other tools that may not be written in C# essentially?
Right. Yeah. It's kind of like, I hate using this word, and sort of like an intermediate layer.
IL?
Yeah,
it's like
I used it.
yeah,
Yeah,
you did on
I
Monday.
used it.
you did. Okay,
Yeah.
they thumped me when I used it like a year ago.
So, but it's still early. Like everything that Fowler just described doesn't work today.
Yeah, nothing
Like
works.
that's like a
It works
part of the
here.
vision.
Yeah.
But Aspire is fully extensible already. It's like people can you can create custom resources. You can define a new resource type. You can model it in to an app host, and then you can add C# methods that will describe what happens when I connect or reference one resource type to another. And then you can control what that gets emitted to in the manifest. And then, of course, if you own a tool that's reading the manifest, you can make it do whatever you like. So it is a platform in the sense that you can already go and use kind of this set of primitives to build out a new experience. And that's what we're attempting to do. We have the building blocks. We have a C# file that's your app host that you can put resources in with an application model and a lifecycle and eventing, all this type of stuff that runs during the inner loop. And then we have this manifest, and we have AZD, which is the current tool that we know can read, or that we've updated to read the manifest. But the goal is that more tools will do that. The goal is more resources will be produced by us and partner teams at Microsoft. So if you want to connect to, the ultimate goal is no matter what Azure resource or wider cloud infrastructure ecosystem resource you want to connect to, there'll be a NuGet package you just pull into your app host project, either from Amazon or from a community member or whatever. And then you'll just, a couple lines of C#, run the deployment tool that makes sense for that, for the thing that you're going to, and the right thing will happen. As you said, the right defaults will take place. Like magic is one word, automatic is another, smart defaults is another.
Easy button.
It's not about being magical. It's just about trying to do the right thing based on what you've described, rather than you as the developer. Well, I described this. This is what I care about as the developer. Why do I have to go in? The other 90% of my job now seems to be figuring out all the other stuff just to get the thing to run securely on the target. That's the part that we're trying to make easier for people to build out, including us for Azure. So hopefully we'll get there. Yeah.
So I'm very new to this. As first I have first time hearing the words and came to this out here. So is it like you use a C# thing to write DevOps procedure?
Yeah, so the question was, from a very beginner point of view, like, is Aspire, part of Aspire anyway, about writing C# to do like DevOps type stuff or infrastructure as code? Fowler said IAC before, infrastructure as code. I mean, the answer is yes and no, in the sense that, yes, that is part of what we're trying to do with Aspire. And that is, if you look at the app host project, which is one part of the larger sort of Aspire stack, then that's kind of what that is doing. You write C# and it describes aspects of a large distributed system where each thing is called a resource. So you have N resources. Some resources are containers, some are databases, some are messaging systems, and some of them are your apps, or written in .NET or Node or Python or Go or whatever they might be. And you want to be able to describe that whole thing in C# and then easily run it during development. And then at some point, assist in deploying that using that information as well. Yes, that's very much what we're trying to achieve with that part of Aspire.
We have like big $500,000 lines of code, Angular application with REST API and the whole thing in Azure.
Mm-hmm.
So like Gaster can encapsulate the whole thing with DevOps.
Yeah, so the point was, we have a very large Angular app, and then we have some web APIs and things, and they run in Azure. Can Aspire encapsulate, or can we describe like those things? Yeah, absolutely.
That's the intent.
That is the intent.
That's the intent.
And you can have an existing app. It's not about us trying to tell you to go and rewrite your apps in a new platform or anything. Aspire is not a new framework for building apps. It's a new set of tools and additional stuff that we've added that lets you say, okay, let me describe this distributed system rather than this one Blazor app or this one Angular app. Let me describe the whole thing in C#. And then when I hit F5, it runs, and when I run this other tool, it gets deployed.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is.
The one caveat that I would make to that is if you've got your apps, like 100,000 lines of code, running in, let's say, various app services or functions, like today, there's no easy button that you could push that would take your Aspire manifest, the JSON that we've been talking about, and create those types of compute resources out of it. Today, we have the easy button for ACA for container apps, and we have not quite as easy button for Kubernetes. But as Damian pointed out, you could use all of your existing CI/CD infrastructure and use Aspire for your dev time goodness. You will have to do a little bit of the configuration yourself that those tools do today on their own. I guess people could probably write their own code and Aspire manifest and generate app services.
You can either do that,
or
I think as Fowler likes to say all the time, the tool is only going to do what you're doing already.
Right.
You're already having to put URLs in config values when you deploy your app into Azure or Amazon or whatever, so that your app code doesn't have to change when you deploy, because you don't want to hard code an address in there, obviously, or a certificate or whatever.
Right.
So you're already using configuration to do that stuff. So that won't change. It just might be that rather than using a certain configuration key that you invented today for your app, because there wasn't a standard for it, use the one that we invented for service discovery for Aspire. For connection strings, we didn't invent a new one. It turns out .NET already has a convention for connection strings, where it's like connection strings : whatever the name of the connection is.
Mm-hmm.
We use that in Aspire. So in Aspire, when you say this app references that database, the app host will inject that database's connection string into the configuration of the app at connection strings : blah. So the app code doesn't have to change at all. In fact, we've had a number of cases now where customers have told us, we did an experiment where we weren't allowed to touch the app code at all, but we wanted to add Aspire and see if it helped us at all. And so what they did is they created a new solution. They added all the existing .NET projects to it without touching the existing one, and they weren't allowed to change any C# in the existing projects. They added just an app host project, and then they wrote C# in the app host project, and then they got it to the point where they could hit F5 and everything worked. Because it turns out all the existing
environments and stuff.
because the existing apps are already reading from configuration, and the configuration system in .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, since version 1, has always looked in the environment variables. So you can just stick environment variables in via C# in the app host project, and it all just works. So that we feel pretty confident that the layering that we chose is correct. It's just being totally transparent, we have struggled a bit in figuring out the right way to explain the layering so that it's easily consumable, because there's quite a lot going on. And if you don't already understand all the layering in .NET and ASP.NET, we have to explain a few things for you to kind of get the flow. But that's the advantage of the workshop and stuff like that. We can really tease stuff apart in more than we can in an hour on stage. But yeah, that's the goal. I encourage you to try it out and kind of play with it and get a sense of how it fits together. Yeah, no problem. Yeah. No, we'll do our best to pick other people if they put their hands up and they haven't yet.
I'm still kind of struggling because the demos I've seen are all super simple. They're like they're all .NET apps, so it's a web app talking to an API, and they show the resiliency and talk to that data too, where you can automatically apply policies to decline things like that. But I'm just wondering, because I don't know, is it I like the code base thing, and I've read Fowler's tweets about YAML sucks. It's much better to have the code base because you can just highlight the technology. So that part's great.
He's not lying.
But I don't know if it's supposed to replace the Docker Compose local thing, or if it's also trying to replace. It sounds like it's trying to replace Terraform on the deployment part. I don't. Okay, so it's not.
No,
I'm not sure.
Think of it.
It's trying to.
Right.
To get back to an actual question, feel free to correct me on the Terraform versus trying to with that kind of stuff. Is like when you have resources that aren't .NET, like for instance, what he was saying, like let's say you need a Node.js Docker container to run because you don't want to run Node.js on your actual machine, or like we use Kafka, Redis, Grafana, Loki, and we need those resources when we need that F5 to run Loki. But of course, when we deploy the file, we're using Kafka cluster, we're using our one Grafana/Loki. So I'm just wondering, how does it provision those resources if it does that yet? Or what would be the plan for provisioning those resources locally when you hit F5? Because the F5 experience looks really cool in the demos, but I'm just not sure how that works with
how that translates.
That aren't .NET.
So I am not sure how to repeat that question, but it's kind of is Aspire trying to work for local dev, where you're seeing very simple examples where we show running things in containers locally, and how does that translate to when you go to a deployed environment where you may have to use Terraform or something real to provision actual assets, or maybe you want to point to an existing resource in a cloud somewhere. How does the whole thing fit together? Are you trying to be dev? Are you trying to be prod? Are you trying to do the whole thing? Like, what does it mean? I think that's kind of what you're asking, right?
With the F5,
Yep.
Like how are you able to start resources that way, or do you have to have a separate Docker Compose cluster for
right.
things that are not code that you're editing, that are resources that would be in the cloud otherwise?
It's a great question.
So you may hear us offhandedly say things like modeling. So the app host, the entire job of the app host is to represent your entire application in whatever way you see fit, right? So our job is to give you primitives building blocks to expose any container, any executable, any remote URL. So you're given these like
Dockerized resource.
Yeah, Dockerized resource.
Yeah.
You're given these like core concepts, and then we build these layers on top of them that look like magic. So we have like add Redis and add SQL Server.
Add Kafka.
But all they're doing is adding a container to the model, and all we're doing is trying to represent what the app needs. Right. So at the end of the day, what we're doing is saying your app needs a Kafka container or a Kafka resource from the cloud or from Azure, and you can choose to model that a local experience and one that's remote in different ways. Like we run code, you can say, when I run locally, I want a Kafka container. When I publish, I want to come from this location.
Yeah.
So you can we give you the tools to model. So when we show it, we always show like super simple Redis, a cache, and then front end, back end, and there you go. But you could do super complex things like, when I'm running locally, I want a container image. When I run in the cloud, ask me for the URL, get it from Key Vault, stick it in there, and reference that from the application. So we're trying to build all these building blocks so you can model arbitrarily complex like local dev stories and full on like prod stories. Not to replace Terraform,
right,
but to use Terraform, use Bicep, use CloudFormation to say, I want to orchestrate both my compute and arbitrary other things. So let's say you were going to like, I don't know, a VM in Azure. Maybe you can slap some Terraform that you had from your company and say like, I'm going to build a custom VM resource that uses Terraform, spins it up in the cloud, and then gets the information required to connect to my application. So we're trying to basically integrate all these systems, not replace them.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Right.
Except for Compose, which are replace that one. Replace that one.
Like to really hyper simplified, if you think about your app host program CS, then you think about your Aspire manifest, and then your Terraform or your Bicep or your ARM or whatever. It's like you write C# code, we generate that JSON file. It's definitely a hyper simplified way to think about it. But then you can generate those other layers, or you can, augment your existing, CI/CD stuff with the existing stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering the local dev with Docker. It sounds like it talks to Docker.
Yes, it does.
Yes, it does. It does.
Any container runtime. So we support two right now. But essentially, we're trying to replace the Docker Compose orchestration with our own C# based orchestration.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. If you think about early on, I was doing some experiments with Quadrant before we had a Quadrant. Quadrant component.
What's Quadrant?
Quadrant is a vector database. It's a vector database.
Like this year. So
yeah. It's a vector database used for doing RAG with OpenAI. So I asked Fowler, I said, hey, I have this thing I need to use it for. And he goes, is it in a container? And I said, yeah, this is at the time where we just had, bring down a container, tell it which port to ping. And then I looked at my JSON file and it was like, oh, there's Quadrant, and I opened up this port. And now my apps know how to talk to it. That's written in Python. So essentially, as long as you've got a containerized resource, Redis, et cetera, you basically say run in a container. That container is going to tell me what port to open, or I'm going to tell it what port to open. And then when you do a with reference, then it basically hits that port and it can find those different services.
You know what it's like? It's like when you try to use Docker Compose or any of these systems where you have to go figure out all the config information used to create the container, expose which ports, get the information from the container, and put it together in a way that the app can use it. Someone did that work for a ton of resources, a ton of containers, like a ton of very commonly used software, and then they put it in a NuGet package, and that's what Aspire is trying to do. It's not as though you couldn't do Docker run Redis / whatever version and then like expose all the same things, but you never remember all the details. Like in Aspire, we're giving you like a NuGet package with IntelliSense, and you can do with blah, and we know the built-in container ports for every container. So we're kind of trying to automate like 5 of the steps that you have to figure out for every new project. So every new dev, every new project have to go through these 10 steps to figure out how to use Redis locally, securely, right?
And add health checks, and add redundancy.
And add persistence. Like how do you which path do you mount into the container to make Redis persistent on local dev? Does anyone know top of your head?
And do you have to set an extra environment variable?
Does anyone know? That's the thing that we do for you. You call with volume mount, and we know because if someone spent time to build a component for Redis, that person was an expert. That person spent time figuring out, okay, here are all the options for Redis exposed via IntelliSense, and you don't have to go look up on Docker Hub every single time you want to do a simple thing, right? So take that and multiply it by every service that you can use in your application. That's kind of what we're trying to get to. Like, we're making consuming those things trivial and then deploying them trivial. That's the intent.
Yeah, but we're not abstracting them. We're just giving you the APIs you already know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're still using Stack Exchange Redis.
Yep.
Still using SQL client. Yeah.
Harder questions. Come
Come on.
on. Break us.
Just tell them.
Oh, we got one back here. Sorry. Hey.
It's a good question.
The question is Aspire production ready? Can I feel confident going to my leaders or bosses and saying we should do this? You know, where are we going to be in a year or two? As I said before, the deployment part of Aspire is not production ready. It's labeled as dev test. We only support ACA with AZD right now, and we don't support customization of anything of the ACA apps that you publish right now. But that is just a very small part of the overall Aspire story. So we would very much encourage you to look at what Aspire brings to the table for the development experience, which includes the Aspire, what we call components today, but we're talking about renaming them because it's the worst name we could have chosen. The libraries, like the Aspire Stack Exchange Redis library and the Aspire MPG SQL Affinity Framework Core library, all of those like Aspire enhanced packages that add a client library to your .NET project, but then also add resilience and add configuration support and add it to DI and configure tracing and observability, telemetry. Those things are all very much production ready because they're just glue. All we did was take the existing packages. In some cases, it's like 5 different packages. You need one for health checks, one for OpenTelemetry, 3 for OpenTelemetry, one for the client library, one to get the DI support, another for the config support. And we pull them all together and we wrap them, expose them, I should say, with a familiar API that integrates the same way no matter which Aspire enhanced library you use, they all integrate in a very similar fashion. That stuff is very much all production ready. And I can tell you that the team is very invested, and leadership, more to the point, is very invested in seeing Aspire succeed and move forward. So I can't really
Everything
say more than
is
that.
except for deployment.
Yeah, deployment is the thing that is definitely not. We're not telling you at all to go and adopt the Aspire deployment story right now, because that is literally just the only thing that we ship right now is the AZD tool, and it can only deploy to ACA, and you can't customize ACA sources with it yet. It is a dev test story right now. But to all the stuff that was spoken about already, the goal, the longer term plan is to enable more and more of that, so that one day there might be very much a turnkey, easy button, as we keep saying, or I want to model everything in my C# in the app host, and I can run AZD up, and no matter how complicated and how many Azure services it uses, it works. Or I can run Amazon's equivalent, or I can run Google's equivalent, and it works. That's the goal for the deployment stuff, but we're definitely not there yet.
And I can give you an example of one of those deltas between where we are today and where we want to be. If you were to just do AZD init, AZD, provision, AZD up, it's not going to do any customizations. There's a command that you can run called AZD %, and that will actually lay down your IAC to disk, and you can go edit it. So if you wanted to customize any of that stuff, you can. I do that pretty frequently. You could also hand that code off to, say, your platform engineering person or your DevOps person. They could lay down your infrastructure, and then you deploy into it. So you do have that capability. But one example is today when you deploy an Aspire app to ACA, we'll create one managed identity for all of your container apps. That's obviously one place where we probably want you to do that %, command and then lay down one individual identity for each one of your apps. We're talking to the team about that, but if in dev time, do you want to create that many principles in your Azure sub? Maybe not. You know what I mean? So, we're definitely optimizing like they've said for the dev experience, and we want to figure out what those deltas are between dev and production. So,
all right, cool.
Yeah.
Also, I'm getting kind of into the QA as well. And I know in test containers, you're able to basically take over the authorization and authentication for in testing in the CI/CD process. Would that be doable within the Aspire?
So I guess it depends exactly on what you mean by the auth part. So we have a testing story whereby we built API that allows you to, from a test, drive an app host project. So you can reference the app host project that you're trying to test, and then get an object that represents that app host with all the application model in a mutable fashion. So the test can now, inspect and, if need be, modify the app host before you actually run it. But can you speak more to what authentication authorization requirements you have?
Sure. Yeah. So we've got an application, let's say, with a database behind it, and the application and an API. If you're running it in a test container, Microsoft test container allows you to basically overwrite the authorization and authentication. You can create your own, and in your testing processes, you would run that test with that custom and mimic what's in live.
I see.
By container, do you mean like DI container or like
it's a test? It's a Docker. It's a test container.
Okay, you mean Docker? You mean actual test containers?
It's
like the
test
package?
Container. Yeah, what test
see.
container does is it basically, it's a container that containerizes the application, but it gives you the chance to overwrite, like I said, authentication. So I can go into roles and I can say, don't go out to Active Directory or wherever and pull in the authentication. Just take my authentication, and I can tell it my authentication, what roles this person is supposed to be in. It'll start the application in that test container with that in that role for that authenticated role, and then run the test, and then it breaks it down, and then the next test runs, and then it'll break it down.
I'm not familiar with that aspect of test containers. I've used it for just very easily getting containerized databases and things within tests. We don't have anything first class like that. Like Aspire actually doesn't model anything to do with security today at all. There's nothing in the Aspire model to do with identity. That said, if you start a Redis using Aspire and then you connect, Redis is a bad example. If you start a Postgres container using Aspire and you have an app in your Aspire app model, like a web API that needs to talk to that Postgres, the container will be started up with a random password or a password that you've modeled in via a parameter, and then that will be automatically injected into the consuming application that's also modeled, so that there's no secrets. You don't have to configure the app to talk to the thing, and that's fully mutable before the app host has started. So you can update all the annotations and attributes of everything in your application model from a test when using our app host like testability support before things run. But if you're talking about role assignment and that type of stuff, like none of that is modeled at all, because that's very specific to a one part of the application domain, which is the identity aspect. And that's not something that we've touched on just yet.
Yeah. So you basically start up the test container as Joe admin, and his role is app admin. So then within your application, you've got decorated an app admin, and can you get into it? Yes. Or should he be able to? Yes or no. And then the test fails or whatever.
Okay.
It's something you could build it, but there's nothing in the box for that that level of off.
Okay.
Right.
And one other thing. I know I just started one up just before we came here and tried it. Is there persistence? I know that everything is in memory for telemetry. Is that, can you put it into persistence?
No. So if you're talking about the Aspire dashboard, it gets launched. No, all the telemetry and logs and metrics that are displayed is all in memory, and we have no plans to add. What
do you do if an application crashes and then you lose all your telemetry?
You buy a real APM system.
Yeah, you buy real APM.
Yeah.
You use Application Insights or New Relic or Datadog or something real.
But you can send all the data to applications.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. You could use any of the OTLP receivers from ETS, et cetera, et cetera. You can save it to Azure Monitor or whatever.
So it would go into open telemetry would go into
Correct.
app host,
Correct.
and you can send it wherever you want.
Yep. Just please use proper redaction.
I wouldn't say that we would never add persistence. I think you should think about the dashboard as a just-in-time view of like real-time metrics.
Yeah.
If there's any persistence, it's to survive the dashboard crashing.
Correct.
It is not to build a database to do queries against your data store. We're not going to turn the dashboard UI or the dashboard telemetry collection into a production level
service.
Right.
No.
Elasticsearch style storage.
Well, yes.
And that's
that's what I'm saying. I love the dashboard. I mean, it's great.
Yeah, it's
go in and figure out what it's doing right now and how and everything. But what happens, if you want to, if there's a cycle that you have to reboot your machine.
So I think that we want to solve. Like we want to be able to pass through state, have it flush to disk, but still keep a buffer that's like 10,000, right? Whatever. And then so you still aren't storing things long term, but you survive the crashes and it can recover for those like very small deployments or whatever.
But to be clear, we have no plans for that yet.
Right.
It's not committed in any way on the roadmap or anything like that. The dashboard is very much a dev focused, whether the dashboard's running in production and you're a developer who needs to figure out what the hell is going on right now in production, or it's running locally. It's very much focused on what's happening right now. And that means if the dashboard crashes, you lose all the data in memory in the dashboard at the moment.
Understood. Okay, thank you.
Damian, is that because it's a developer time experience?
It's the developer focused experience. Developer time means that it makes no sense to put it in production, put it in anything other than the developer machine. But we support running the dashboard in environments other than your local dev bot. So when you deploy to ACA, the dashboard is running in ACA. The dashboard is available as a container image. You can deploy it anywhere you like. It hosts an OTLP endpoint, so things can push data to it, and it defines a resource protocol so that you can have the resources page be fed by anything. It doesn't just have to get fed by the app host project during inner loop. It can be fed by ACA's backend that says these containers are running, or you could write your own server that pushes resource information to it if you really wanted to.
Somebody wrote one actually for Docker Compose.
For Docker Compose, there you go.
Yeah, we don't have one yet for Kubernetes. So if you were to use the Aspirate tools that we were talking about earlier, whenever you do the steps, in the CLI, one of the questions is, do you want me to turn on the dashboard? Yeah, of course you do. It's hot. So you turn the dashboard on. The first thing you notice is there's no resources page, but you see everything else. So at some point we'll have it.
That's a matter of time, I think. If somewhere that's going to happen one way or another.
Yeah, that will happen. It just hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
So once because when I saw it, I went, "Where's the resources page?" So yeah. I think this gentleman
There's more questions down here.
There's one down here, on our left. There's a microphone coming towards you. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, just kind of a follow-up question about the developer dashboard. And I get that's not really a production thing. It's something to watch and something maybe we can use somewhat in production for our perspective. Is there a way to access that data through an API or programmatically? Because it is a nexus of information from several places, and it would be convenient to expose that in a separate application, a different web UI.
It's only one, but the OTLP data is not accessible.
It's just an endpoint.
Push in.
No.
You can't retrieve.
I think if you want to get it, you would put a collector in front of the dashboard, and then you would push from that to the dashboard onto other sources.
Like an intermediary. That's
Yeah.
And they would actually capture all the stuff, the actual application logs and the configuration, because there's a lot of stuff in there.
There's lots.
Full fidelity.
Yeah. To be clear, the dashboard has two aspects. There's resources and the open telemetry driven stuff.
Yep.
Things like console logs, they actually come from the resources side. They don't come from the open telemetry side because console logs come from things that are running, right? They're scraped. So,
I have my own site. Grab all those things from all those places. But if you've already got the resources and you've already got the config, then
does the resources API let you query resources, or is it only that you push updates? It does.
It's a gRPC API. But when you're running outside of the local dev, there's no server that we wrote that you can.
You'd have to write.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
No worries.
More questions.
I think this gentleman.
Yeah, red shirt right here.
Red shirt had one, did he?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, actually.
Oh, there you go. Answered by proxy.
That's good.
I have two questions. One's really easy. You said in passing that you support 2 container hosts, one other than Docker. I'm just wondering what it like if you support like Podman.
Podman's the other one. Yep.
That's what I was wondering if that was the other one.
With some qualifiers, there's a couple of scenarios that don't work right now, networking related, that we need to work through.
Yeah, Podman's not a thing on Windows, right? Like
Apparently it is.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah.
The only reason we support it on Windows is because people complained that
We found out. We're like, oh, what?
Yeah,
What's
yeah.
going on with
I've only looked at it because of the rootless stuff. But anyway, the other question I had is around health checks. I noticed in the very simplistic example that was shown, the person that was presenting had an ARM laptop. So one of the things, I think it was an Angular app, for some reason it wouldn't run on ARM because I guess it must have been dependent on binaries for x86 or something. So it was red. So I noticed the green and red, that was very prominent. Are you automatically generating any health checks in the apps, or
wouldn't that be great
for health? Are you just using processes running basically?
So, well, there's a couple of things. The red and green that you're seeing is not driven by health checks. It's driven by the orchestrator. So the part that talks to Docker, and the part is the same part that like launches your projects or says to Visual Studio, can you please launch this project with debugging and stuff all behind the scenes. That's the part that's going green or red. So if it launches a thing and then the thing fails immediately, or it's monitoring it and after 10 seconds it stops, then you'll see that. It has no internal knowledge, it has no probing knowledge of the thing, but that is planned. We have an issue track like log to do that. I actually wrote that up a few months ago. The goal is to add health probes as a new model construct in the app host and then have that represented in the dashboard somehow. What we do today is for your .NET projects that you use the Aspire service defaults project for, which is just a class, it's basically just a template that we give you as part of the Aspire experience. I don't want to undersell it though. It's a template that is designed and the tooling sets you up so that all of your like ASP.NET projects reference this in your Aspire solution. And it's where all your cross-cutting concerns are configured. So OpenTelemetry is configured there for .NET. Resiliency, the service discovery is configured in there. And health checks are automatically configured in there for you as well. So it adds the health check like DI system, and then B, it actually adds the endpoints. And that just adds 2 endpoints. It's not opaque. It's literally the code is in the template. You could just see like it adds /alive and adds /health. So you can edit those as necessary. And then the last aspect of health checks that we have today is those Aspire libraries I alluded to, like our Aspire library for Postgres, for MPG SQL Postgres. One of the things that they bring in are health checks. So they register a health check that's appropriate for whatever external system you're integrating. With that library. So when you add Redis, we register a health check for Redis automatically in the actual apps, not in the app host, if that makes sense. So it exposes that endpoint. We don't use that today by default. Nothing in the default experience actually uses that, but I do have an example in this Aspire samples repo that I pushed up like a month ago. Yeah. That is an example of how you would extend that a bit and then actually add a health checks UI container as another container in your overall app model, so that when you hit F5, you get a second dashboard, which is the ASP.NET Core Health Checks UI. I don't know if you've seen it. It's actually an existing container that someone in the community wrote a while ago. And I auto-configure that as part of the custom resource I wrote. And so when you hit F5, you get full health checks like dashboard for all of the health checks in the entire system, communicated between all the resources. So again, just another example of the type of things you can do using the building blocks that are there, even if there's not a turnkey, super opinionated way to do it right now.
Yeah, and you said that you're working on the health check, so I would just ask that I assume that you'll be able to register custom ones because the app might be alive and be healthy, but if you're depending on some other dependency, we have health checks that we register that will return whether or not we can connect to a no-op dependency. So that would be good if we do that. But I thought maybe the red-green was based off that. But
yeah, no, it's not. That's a natural. It makes sense that you would think that, and that we've been wanting to do that ever since we kind of got the red-green on there. It just hasn't got to the top of the priority list yet. But definitely, there'll be 2 sides of it, like most things. There'll be the health checks themselves, and then the health probes, which are the things that check the health checks and then relay status. And so both of those would likely get modeled in. And because we already have a health check primitive in .NET, in the Microsoft extensions.health checks, that would likely be the primitive that we build this support on. So you could just add a custom. And then that could also drive the other thing, which we get asked about, which is wait for dependency. So the ability to say, hey, don't start this resource until this other resource is started, if nothing else, just in the inner loop so that my apps always start cleanly when I'm doing development. That could be based on health checks as well as another input. So not only have I started it, but it has transitioned to the healthy state. Now go and start this other resource that relies on that. don't do it until this has gone to healthy. So that's something that we definitely want to look at doing.
Yeah, that would. One more thing, sorry. That would be good if you could declare that, because obviously in the cloud you're going to be resilient and stuff like that. But with Docker Compose, you can say it depends on.
Yes.
And then you can have a graph there.
Yep. Yeah.
Those dependencies, so it starts up in the correct order. Especially if you have scripts that need to precede something. Or
we have a prototype of that today. So Fowler wrote a prototype. It's in a separate repo that shows you how you could build that using the existing building blocks that we have. But the goal is to actually take that and productize it and just bake it in as a first class thing.
Awesome. Thank you.
Now we get to the shy part of the panel.
Yeah.
All the questions are exhausted. The hard part. So I'll ask a question. Who has actually installed Aspire and used it like on their machine? Who's tried to create an app or do anything at all? Anyone? One hand. I see one hand. 2, 3, 4. Now they're coming up. 5, 6. Okay, a few folks.
All right.
7. So the rest of you who haven't yet, you've obviously heard about it, and that's why you're here. I'd love to ask you a question, and then you give me back the answer. Like, what is why are you interested in it? Like, why are you even here if you haven't looked at it yet? And B, what is the thing that you're waiting for? Like, is it? Do you think it just doesn't apply? Do you think that this is like it's missing a thing, or you're still in the phase of like trying to figure out what it is? So I'm not really sure it applies. It looks like it. It's coming from the .NET team. It must be to do with what I do, but I'm not really sure what it is yet. Does anyone want to offer there?
Is it, okay, I didn't know if it was on. Sorry, what was A?
Oh gosh, I wish I remembered.
I remember the second one was like, what's the blockers? But I forgot what the first question was.
Haven't seen it.
Why are you here?
Why are you here?
Well,
what drew you here? If you haven't,
I had an answer to the first thing, but I forgot what the first thing was because the second thing last.
The most existential question.
Yeah, but the reason that I haven't looked into it yet for professional use is just not sure if all of the things that we're using are there's already providers for those things, because obviously I know that you've done a lot of work to support a lot of things, but I'm guessing there's probably going to be things so I don't want to go really far down that until he was kind of saying, is it production ready, where 99% of the things would be represented, and so I don't go down and I'm like, okay, well I moved from Docker Compose this, and then I'm at a point where oh well, I can't actually use it yet because this other thing isn't there, or I've got to go create the thing and then do a PR. So that's basically the reason. If I could remember what your first question was, I had an answer to that, but I don't remember.
I wish I could remember. I was just trying to prompt you to prompt folks to get it wasn't that well thought out.
I do want to say about the blockers. The thing about you having to create something and send a PR, you don't have to send a PR. You can just make a thing and keep it in your repository. I think one of the big things about choosing code over YAML is you can build reusable packages that encapsulate containers, resource, whatever you want to encapsulate, and have that be used in your projects, your team's projects, your company's projects. You don't have to publish a container to Docker Hub to build an Aspire resource or component. And then on the other half of it, if you're looking for an Aspire thing and it's not there, it's not as though what you're doing right now isn't what we would have done anyway. So in your app, if you're using, I don't know, call it a database that we don't support, obscure database. We support most things.
Neo4j.
Okay, perfect. Neo4j, right? You don't see a Neo4j component in Aspire.
Yeah.
If you Aspire file your app, you don't have to delete your current code that uses Aspire, the Neo4j. That code still works. Yeah. Right. So there's no real big, I think, cost or required movement just to adopt the basics. Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
I remember with the first one, you said, why are you interested in Aspire?
Oh, yes.
Yes, thank you. We completely agree. Yeah.
YAML drove me here.
Our other conversation, he said provider. We didn't think of that.
Provider is overloaded.
For a component.
It's overloaded?
EF already uses provider.
Okay.
So, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, we're debating
handler.
what terms to use to describe different parts.
It could be a vote.
No.
We can make it a vote.
Votes are the worst way to set up.
Okay, vote. Perfect.
Voting is how we got into auto provision.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm here because I wanted to get some clarity around what Aspire is.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it everywhere, but I don't understand it.
Okay.
And this has provided a lot more clarity, but I also wanted to get some clarity around what the capabilities are long term.
Right.
And I think I got that covered with the manifest, JSON,
Yep.
CI/CD, and all that. But that's what was really blocking me, because the infrastructure is so attractive
Yeah.
in a small startup.
Yep.
Yeah, it is.
It really is. But can we do it? Probably not if the providers or whatever we're going to calling them aren't there.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, those can be authored. We're in the process of creating additional ones now. We're trying to curate them, right? Is that the right word?
Yeah, we don't want to have to own them all.
Yeah, we don't have
That
to own them
doesn't
all.
scale.
I mean, just so you understand, like we in the very beginning, we wrote like 3 or 4 of these things, right? And it took us maybe half a year to figure out how to crack the nut of like, here's how you make this so someone could generate these.
Yeah.
So like the last 10 resources were done by the community sending PRs.
Right.
Like it's trivial to add them, right?
How do you get involved with that? Let's say I want to write a provider. How would I get involved with that?
We have a doc actually. There's actually a document that tells you how to add a whole like end-to-end resource for mail dev, I think.
Yep.
So copy that tutorial. It just shows you it shows you how to build a custom, what are we calling it now? Integration.
I want to call it
Integration.
A custom integration is our new name.
You heard it here first.
And it explains how it works.
Yeah.
And if you know C#, you'll grok it like pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's pretty quick. And one of the things that you can do is you can go to github.com/.net/Aspire, and you can go to the components folder and just pick a component and start walking through the code of that component and literally see how those see how those integrations are built, as you go. So you can do that. It's all in GitHub. So you can see all that.
So there's 2 types of integration. This is why we've struggled with the name, because we had a name originally, the component name, but that only covered one part of integrating a system. So the new plan, as of this morning, is we call them Aspire integrations. And there are 2 aspects. And some integrations only have one aspect and some have both. So there is a hosting integration, which is how do I build a custom resource that goes into the app host that I can say like add Redis or add new integration I'm trying to support that we don't support.
Container image, for example.
And usually it'll be
add Neo4j.
It's backed by add Neo4j, for example.
Yeah, right.
Usually that will involve being backed by a container image, but not always. Like the Azure ones aren't always like that. So adding an Azure resource in the app host doesn't add a container image most of the time. It just adds a bunch of config and knowledge so that you can then connect to that thing. The other type of integration is what today is called components, which we're going to reterm, I think, library integrations, which are just bring the thing into my actual web API or my Blazor app and do it so that it's resilient and so I can configure it and it has retries and it has service discovery and health checks. Like do all that stuff, all that Aspire goodness through one library. That's all that part is. And so we've got docs on both of those today already.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you're kind of touching on, one of the early slides that Damian presented, I think it was to some of our other cloud native teams, was he kind of showed 7 steps. The first 5 steps were acquisition, I think the first 2
discovery, acquisition.
Yeah, it was like discovery, acquisition, and then write code. It was like all just to get Redis with resiliency with health checks. And you think, well, what if I don't need resiliency and health checks? Guess what? You will eventually. You know what I mean? So, so it's just like we do that for you with Add Redis. And then you can turn it off if you want to. You know what I mean? So.
It's not like you couldn't do it yourself. Right. Like people were doing this before we had Aspire. It's just that we're going ahead and doing it for all of these very specific services that are very commonly used. And we're spending a lot of time trying to figure out what's the best way to do health checks, best way to do retries, best way to do DI for this thing. And we handle all the nuances of all the mundane crap so you can use the client library in your apps.
Yep.
Right. That's kind of the purpose.
And I don't know if it was a joke image that Emo created, or we had an API of at one point, but early on, I remember looking at something and it just had something to the extent of builder.services.withopinions. And I was like, that's it.
That was you. That was before we did service defaults.
Right.
We were figuring out, is it going to be a template or is it just going to be a method you call and like it changes everything?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
step as we start heading towards a cloud-hosted environment. We've been on-prem for a while. We have a data center next to our building. Latency's never been an issue. Platform's not an issue. We've got 30 gigs or 300 gigs of bandwidth next to us. Being in a cloud doesn't make a lot of sense immediately for us.
Yeah.
But our aging infrastructure of IT, all of our old legacy apps, we're looking to overhaul those. And we've been working for a streamlined process to get into a .NET native cloud environment, knowing that at some point, the resiliency of being off-prem will always be something that we look to as more and more of our software companies are off-prem. And more of our software as a service is heading that way. So that's still, for me, technically, I'm looking that direction. And one of the things that's been an issue for me in the past is having good insights to our current cloud-hosted stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the Aspire dashboard seems like it'll offer a lot of questions for the stuff that we're dealing with. As a side note question of the .NET environment stuff, other than the web aspects of Maui calls, are there any insights that can be given to a Maui app in runtime at all?
Well, that's a good question. We actually have some folks from the Maui team who are experimenting with integrating Maui. I think they've gone further than experimenting. I think they're actually committing to doing it now.
Yeah.
I don't want to promise stuff they haven't promised.
We can, they're here.
Okay, good. That they're looking to basically integrate Maui into the dev experience for Aspire so that you can have an Aspire solution with web apps and have a Maui client app and you hit F5 and the right thing happens. So they're definitely interested in it because they acknowledge that a lot of Maui customers have Maui apps that are talking to .NET backends. And one of the most painful part of the dev experience today is getting that to work because of IP addresses and proxies and emulators and certificates and all that type of rubbish. So they really are looking at that. They prototyped that first way back before we even announced, last October. And I know they're working on it again now. So I don't have any timelines or anything for you other than to say that the Maui folks are looking at that, how to make that a bit better.
And we're talking about things like, what is it? The Ngrok.
Oh, I mean, dev tunnels.
Dev tunnels.
Yeah, because a lot of the Maui folks want to dev tunnel in because they need to go out and come back. So that's one of the features we're also talking about, is being able to dev tunnel into your thing. So.
And also having such a secure network on our side, we can do SSL offloading and we can get right into the middle of that traffic and see what's in the middle of it. Trying to get to a cloud and losing that layer.
Yeah, that's tough.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you could go into a whole conversation about security.
I mean, it sounds like you've got a cloud next door,
Yeah. I'll just say, I think the reality of today's world and running in the cloud,
where the cloud is someone else's computer and you have to do security all the way everywhere to as deep and much deeper than you've ever thought you had to go before.
Yes, please.
And that's the reason why all the Azure services and things have these capabilities now. It's I need to know that every byte of traffic that comes out of this virtual port on my app here is encrypted before it leaves and is only intended for that target over there. That stuff's still hard and it's getting easier because we realize it's very important. And that is, as an aside, also something that we care a lot about on the Aspire team. So there's an effort going on right now around if I use Aspire and I add some Azure stuff, make it secure by default.
Secure as possible.
Right? Where secure by default means it's as secure as possible based on the best practice recommendations. Trade it off, obviously, against product needs. The reality is that the best practice recommendations for security require you days to get going, to get one app to talk to another. That's just the reality because it's a lot of work to do well. So that there will be some balance there, but we need to make sure that we set you up for success, set you up that has not been true, I think, for a long time. You just want Hello World to work the first time you run it, and then you worry about securing it later, but that just doesn't really fly anymore. It's just too easy to get it wrong. So it
needs to be Hello Secure World.
Hello Secure, yeah. Secure Hello World.
Which is kind of insane.
It's hard. It's really hard. Has anyone ever tried to use, if you have ever as a dev tried to get one app to talk to another app locally on your machine where the other app is in a container, but you want to use a self-signed certificate so you get TLS between the two. Oh, and just to throw it in there, one app's running on one platform and one's running on another, one's Java and one's .NET. That is really hard today. It's not straightforward at all. It's something that we're hoping to improve with Aspire so that if you coordinated both sides with Aspire, we'll just take care of it for you for example. We do it for .NET today, and we're extending it to .NET on Linux as part of .NET 9. So we have our dev cert. If you don't know today, ASP.NET Core is HPS by default in development because we have this dev cert we lay down for you, but it doesn't work on Linux today properly, but we're fixing that in .NET 9. But once you then have to talk to something in a container that runs locally, then it stops working because we don't do the injection of the certificate. Unless you use the VS Container tools, then it does do it. But it's very complicated. So that's the type of thing that we want to make sure works by default, let alone secure once you've actually deployed, which is a whole other complicated area. All right, we've only got we've got 10 minutes left. Oh, I thought he was too. That's all right. Go for it.
So let's pretend the Redis integration component didn't exist.
Yeah.
And I wanted to contribute that because I think everyone will use Redis. What are the gates that you have?
Great question.
Great
question.
I only want, what if my company's DevOps, we have a Redis cluster, so I don't need to deploy it. I don't need to deploy AWS. So I just create the Docker local container version of it, especially not Podman. I don't know what configuration is necessary. What would you accept a partial thing, or do I have to know how to do Docker, Podman, AWS, Azure? Do I have to do all of that for a PR to be accepted?
So the question was about what are the gates if I add a new integration to host something? Say Redis didn't exist; it was Redis. What are the gates to get that added to Aspire? Because I think it's something everyone would benefit from. This is a super topical question. I had a meeting about this morning. One of our goals with Aspire early on was to bootstrap the ecosystem. We realized that we had to own quite a large number of these and get it going. Because if we just built a platform and didn't build any integrations for it, we couldn't expect the world to come and just do it. We had to do the first lot. What we haven't quite figured out yet is when do we pull back from that and start instead being clearer about, well, what about the stuff that isn't in our repo or isn't Aspire owned by the Aspire account on NuGet or isn't owned by us? So we're actually talking about that right now. We're actually, to be totally honest with you, we're already at the point where the team is struggling to deal with the amount of contributions that people are bringing, because you have hit the nail on the head. A lot of people are already looking at Aspire and going, I love this. I want to add support for X, Y, Z, da, 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 da. And so we're already dealing with that. The current thought is that we will always maintain a central set and we will define some policy, some set of gates, as you put it, around what we accept and what we don't. Probably also reserving just that benevolent dictator thing of sometimes we'll just decide we don't want to add this one for whatever reason, right? And those will be kind of the premium, the ones in the box. It just really means it's the ones that we maintain.
The most obvious one, right?
The most obvious ones.
It has to be ubiquitous.
Yeah.
Someone sent a PR for some obscure library, and we just said no because it's not there has to be a certain level of used by everyone-ness, Redis, for example, right? It's well known,
there's also
used by everyone.
There's that, but there's also a future judgment in play because we don't want to add things that for whatever reason we think have a higher chance of maybe not being ubiquitous next year or the year after that, because then we get kind of these weird parts of the system that why does it support that 5 years from now? We've got this thing that we can't delete.
Yeah, we don't want to be the CNCF.
No,
we don't want to be that.
Yeah.
So
Valky and
there's that part, but then we also want to ensure that we can facilitate a wider ecosystem of more niche or more specialized integrations, even if we don't own them.
Yeah.
And it's somehow at least hold them to, I don't want to say hold them to a standard, because the whole point is we don't want to have to do the work because we can't scale infinitely, but have them all look somewhat similar and have them all be somewhat repeatable. And so we're kind of talking about what that might look like right now so that you can walk up to Aspire as a customer. You can add the ones that we support, but then you find that one of the ones that you need to use isn't supported by us, but it's part of this other ecosystem, the wider ecosystem, and you still feel somewhat confident that we're aware of it and that we have some control to do things if really bad things happen. We are throwing around some models for what that might look like right now.
What does that look like to implement it externally? It didn't belong in your thing, but
yeah.
Is that like a NuGet?
They're all just NuGet packages.
Yeah,
so to be clear, even our own are NuGet packages. So
it's a C# class.
Yeah, exactly. They're just literally you implement a few interfaces and you put it in a package. The extra thing that we're talking about is, tag the package with these tags, and then it'll show up in the Aspire acquisition and discovery experience, right? Those type of things. One of the ideas being thrown around is that maybe there's a ring of packages where they can be in any repo owned by anyone, but if you submit it to us, we'll do like a checklist. Yep, we checked it for this, we checked it for this, we checked it for this, and as long as it passes those things, we will accept being a co-owner of the package on NuGet. And that has two advantages. One, as a co-owner, that's the filter we use in Visual Studio. When you say add .NET Aspire package, all we do is filter the NuGet dialog and say, just show us packages owned by Aspire. So if we're a co-owner, you would show up in that experience, even if we don't have commit rights to the code, to the repo. The other advantage of being a co-owner is that if something really bad did happen to that package and maybe the owner abandoned it and then there was a vulnerability in it or something like that, we could go and delist the package, or we could fork the repo and then ship a new version of the package because we're a co-owner. We call that the break glass scenario, in emergency break glass. So that's one of the ideas that we're throwing around right now that might be a way to kind of open it up without having to own everything, even if we do have a little bit of ownership. And it's kind of like trying to balance that people are confident to use these things, but we don't have to own them all.
This is not supported on AWS.
Right.
Cool. We don't have that yet.
That would be cool. So to be clear, they're just NuGet packages. And so, there are two types of integrations. You've got the library ones and you've got the hosting ones. The Azure and AWS ones are totally different on the hosting side, are totally different worlds. Like you wouldn't build one that supports both, because the Azure one needs to depend on the Azure stuff, all the other Azure packages, and the AWS ones need to support all the AWS stuff, because those are for modeling like Azure specific services. Like the Azure Flexible Postgres hosting support is a specific one for that service, versus the Redis one we have isn't cloud specific at all. It's just a container. Like it doesn't know anything about any cloud, but there is an Azure Redis service. And so if they wanted to have the ability to model things in Aspire that are unique to the Azure Redis service, then they could have an Azure Redis hosting package that probably maybe depends on
which we have today.
Which we have. There you go. And it would expose not just the core, I want to run Redis, but also all the Azure stuff. And Amazon would do a similar thing.
I actually just got a question. I got a question from a longtime listener, first-time caller.
Oh, excellent.
Cool. Quote, what if I am multi-cloud with Aspire and I want my front end with GCP, but I want my back end on Azure? Will Aspire work for me? And you could probably extend that somewhat and talk about multi-cloud, yada, yada, yada.
Will it just work? No.
Right.
No. I mean, I think one thing to take away from this conversation is learn the primitives, learn the building blocks, learn how the system works. Then you can figure out if you can model those things in your application. So there's nothing today, there's no tool that can take an Aspire manifest and can put one piece of compute on GCP and one piece of compute on Azure and then make that all work. That's not impossible. We're not going to build that. Right. So it's not as though it can't be done, but I wouldn't sit here and say, well, there's no, someone has to create a tool that understands both clouds and can do this.
Radius.
Yeah, and can do magic, right? But I think the key point there is that we're building a platform for cloud vendors and software owners to kind of like represent resources in either their cloud or in containers or in executables. You can model a lot of things. And we're going to model for Azure because we own Azure, we're Microsoft, and Amazon will do AWS, and Google will do GCP, and maybe someone will be super smart and will figure out how to make them all do this. But that's not our primary scenario. So unless we see the masses asking for that, we won't go make it work.
And one thing to call out there is, when you're thinking about multi-cloud, he's mentioned Service Bus a few times. If you're building on AWS, you're probably not going to bring in the Service Bus package. I mean, I guess you could, but that we're not going to create abstractions. So you're not going to have a messaging.
Super important point, I guess.
It's a really bad example. You're not going to have a messaging abstraction. I'm sorry. You're not going to have a messaging abstraction in Aspire like that. It goes cross cloud.
Your code still if you're doing multi-cloud in a way that is I'm going to use Redis and Redis runs on any cloud, that's reasonable because your app code is going to use Redis, the client APIs, and you will just change where it points to, right? if you're going to use Service Bus on Azure and what is it on SMS? I don't know what SQS on Amazon.
Yeah.
Like, we're not going to help you. Like, you have to write the code to like use different client libraries based on where you're running and deal with the idiosyncrasies of like using either one. Maybe mass transit can help you or in Service Bus. Sure, but we aren't aiming to solve that problem.
Right.
We're aiming to help you model what you want to build. So if you want to model me working in both Amazon and Azure at the same time, and
you can do that.
You can model two resources and then find some tool that can understand both of them at the same time.
Or just use two tools. You could model both.
Yeah.
And then run the Amazon tool over it, and then run the Azure tool over it, and they'll just both deploy the bits they understand.
It'll probably break.
Right? But there's no coordination.
It definitely won't work.
Yeah. I mean, like Fowler said, we're not going to build it. So here's a startup idea.
Yeah.
You know?
All right, we've got a question back here.
Oh, one right at the back. Yep.
Well, one up here too. Go ahead.
So my question is mostly about Aspirate and AZD. So with our infrastructure, we often deploy to a local Kubernetes cluster.
Yep.
Let's say from a 10 project solution, only like the 1 or 2 projects that have actually changed. It seems right now, from what I could tell, that these solutions only support deploying all the projects at once if there's like a change to the solution. And so with NetAspire, is that something you would plan to support, like just deploying the 1 or 2 projects?
So AZD does support incremental deployment right now. It's supposed to work if you do AZD up every time. It actually like sends the desired state, and the actual state diff is done in Azure. It's not done.
It doesn't work for the actual projects though.
It doesn't work for the actual projects.
Yeah, but you could do AZD deploy service name.
You can run AZD deploy service name and just run the ones that deploy the ones that you want to change, but it's not automatic.
And I think you can do that with Aspirate as well, can't you? Can't you target?
You can.
Yeah. Okay. So
but the intent is that we want that to work.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And I want you to have that in VS. We just haven't built that into VS yet. So I would like, when you do the right-click publish thing in VS to ACA, it sits on top of AZD, but we don't have the individual, AZD, deploy service foo. We don't have that yet. I'd like to add that. I miss having that. So.
Just one more question. Is there any rollback service in AZD right now or planned or?
We're not the AZD team.
Rollback.
You can each thing is a deployment, right? So you can roll back the previous deployment.
Yeah, you can roll back a deployment. That's an Azure.
What do you mean rollback exactly?
Yeah, just like rollback.
Like Kubernetes, like ACA is. I don't want to say that it's tied to the actual compute environment, but if you're using Kubernetes, that you would use something in that that world, right?
Yeah, we wouldn't build that. That's specific to the deployment environment.
So for ACA specifically, like what we support today for ACA, there's no rollback feature for deployment. It is like you would just deploy a new version.
New revision.
A new revision, yeah.
Well, to be clear though,
but you can actually like
it gets nuanced. Yeah, you can go.
You can go back if you want.
You can go and choose a previous revision on ACA, and it'll just ACA will flip that resource back to the previous revision, but you didn't drive that from AZD.
But it is coupled to your compute environment.
Yeah.
So ACA has revisions, and when you deploy via Aspire, we set traffic on the old revision to like 0 and the new one 100%. We don't have any features right now that says like swap back to like 100 and 0, so you can go back in time. But my assumption is when deployment becomes more prod ready, we'll have to like expose a ton of knobs for doing that kind of stuff.
I think you had questions as well.
A couple of years ago, there was this Azure Service Fabric that was possible
on
different providers like Amazon and so on.
Yep.
So that maybe people can use, but I'm not sure if that is dead or it's no investment done anymore in Microsoft on that one.
So the question was about Service Fabric, and you could have, I think before you could run it on premise, or you could run it, or you could use it in Azure, right? That's kind of where it is. And you were asking if there's any investment in that tech still.
So the two questions. One is, as I understand, it can be run in different cloud providers like Amazon and Microsoft.
I've never seen Amazon run anything in Service Fabric. Maybe you can run it yourself. Maybe if you deployed it to Amazon Cloud, but they don't have a Service Fabric offering in Amazon.
Yeah, but that's what I think Mark Rusanovich mentioned in some conference. I don't have experience, but he mentioned.
You definitely can deploy a Service Fabric cluster in Amazon.
Okay, but is it something that you do any investment more or not?
It's still used internally. So some services are like the core of Azure, the bottom of Azure, the storage, networking, those all use Service Fabric. Newer services use Kubernetes.
Yeah.
So there's still a huge team working on this thing. They like support it every day. A lot of Microsoft is built on top of it. So I wouldn't say it was like go away overnight. But for newer services, they're mostly built using Kubernetes internally at Microsoft.
Right. Yeah. Service Fabric, these are not my words, but it was sort of portrayed to me as something that we primarily use internally now and not as much used by external customers. But there are external customers using it who were using it when when it was an external facing tool, but Kubernetes is really the way forward.
And there's still a huge team. The team is massive that works on it. So it's not
going away.
Yeah, it's not going away.
No.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question. It's a little bit hypothetical, but if I can make like infrastructure as code, like maybe Terraform or something that is inspired by Aspire, and is maybe agnostic in context of Azure, will that mean that I can then deploy it everywhere?
Good question.
That's what Radius is. Right?
There's tech from the CTO's office, Mark Martin's like office, called Radius. And what they did was they took parts of the guts of the deployment engine from Azure, and they took Bicep from the Azure space, and they have this cross-platform Bicep. So Bicep is the language used to describe resources in Azure and configuration. And they took that and said, okay, let me write what's called a resource provider, the thing that runs in the cloud that does deployments, and make it work on multiple clouds. So you can deploy a container, and it will do one thing in Azure and do a different thing in Amazon. So this thing exists. It's immature. It just came out this year.
Yeah.
It's still being built. In theory, imagine it was like popular and everyone used it. And you could imagine building an Aspire Radius integration, where you could represent Radius resources in Aspire. You can say like, give me a Redis, and it would spin up the right thing in the right cloud. But we wouldn't be the one owning how it gets spun up. That's like us going through a different layer of indirection to say like, I'm going to deploy this asset to Radius, and then Radius can deploy it to Amazon or Azure or Google. So yeah, in theory, you could make it all work.
I want to add one last thing as we finish up here. One thing that's different about Aspire from previous efforts in this space at Microsoft, whether it be Service Fabric or other things, this is the first one built by the .NET team. This is the first time us, who are the folks who invented ASP.NET Core, .NET Core, that whole experience that you use there to build your apps, that we actually took a step back and went, let's try and build something that lets you model something larger than just one app. Like, we just have not done that before. So if that's worth anything to you,
and it's built for devs, I think.
We think it is, and it's built for .NET devs. It's built for devs, primarily .NET devs. So we think that that's worth something, and that hopefully will be the thing that makes the difference this time. Is that we obviously get to learn from everything that's come before us. We get to learn. We're being driven by the wider ecosystem and very much by what customers are doing, rather than trying to invent a new thing that we want the whole world to move to. We're like, no, we just want to make what you're doing now easier. That's all it really is. We're not trying to sell you something new. We just encourage you to try it. As Fowler said, learn how it works, learn the building blocks. And I think you'll see it for what it is. It's just an enabler to do what you do already in a much nicer, more .NET friendly way. We're like 5 minutes over now.
Yes. I just want to. Do you guys have social media other than David? Like that? Because I found out about Aspire before, but you didn't have a contact card.
Oh, I'm at Damian Edwards on X.
Oh, okay.
So you feel free to ping me there.
I'm on LinkedIn. That's it.
If you hang out in Discord has the kind of the bleeding edge people who are using Aspire like in insane ways, and you can see how they began to realize I could extend this thing, and they're doing all kinds of insane stuff that we hadn't even planned to do, right? So definitely go there.
Your Discord's the place. You have Acker for
that? We do. AKMS/Aspire/Discord.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks all. Appreciate it.